Back towards the start of January this year, the game Heaven Burns Red was taken down off of VNDB, showing that the people that run that website no longer considered it to be a visual novel. This ended up sparking a fair amount of controversy within the visual novel community, to where people were starting to question, what exactly does it mean to be a visual novel? How exactly can you define it? And with a fair amount of people holding the game Heaven Burns Red quite dearly to themselves, one person even took it upon themselves to create a competitor website to VNDB out of this controversy. And so today I wanted to tackle this pretty broad question as to what exactly qualifies as a visual novel. But considering that this is a pretty nuanced question in the first place, I decided to reach out to a number of different content creators here on YouTube that also cover visual novel content and get their personal takes on how they would define a visual novel. This is going to be a pretty long one. Without further ado, let's get into it.
For me, I've always been pretty lax when it comes to any strict, rigid definitions for what makes a visual novel a visual novel. With how niche of a medium it is, I can understand the want to tighten those qualifications, but personally, I'm slightly more loose, instead classifying them into two camps depending on the reliance and frequency of gameplay. There are those I call pure VNs that 100% stick purely to reading and choices like Fate Stay Night, Planad, Umineko, even Little Busters that has a few minigames sprinkled throughout I would throw in here too. For these, it's the experience you would expect when you hear the term visual novel. Minimal interactivity aside from menus and choices. Then there are those I hesitate to call pure VNs because of their inclusion of gameplay, but share just enough DNA that they sneak their way in under the umbrella. Text-centric RPGs like Rants, Utawarerumono, and Heaven Burns Red, where the primary method of storytelling is told via novel-flowing text with gameplay in between for things like combat or the to and from. That last mention there, Heaven Burns Red, brought quite the stir around it recently, with its VNDB listing being suddenly taken down years after it was made. And, along with Radiant's kind invite, is the main inspiration for me to think about this topic. Mainly because the reasons for its takedown highlight the main points that strike at the heart of this debate. Lack of narration and gameplay. You could argue this is a technicality, but there is narration. While relatively lighter, the first-person perspective of Ruka describing the scenery, meandering in her thoughts and impressions is all still narration. Remove the portrait and nameplate, and it would show the only difference is presentation. Now, the gameplay, that can't be refuted, but carries the same balance and intrusiveness, besides a gacha, as titles like Rants or the Fate Extra games, which I was surprised to see listed there. I think it all comes down to how you would describe it to someone unfamiliar, wanting them to check it out. I can't sell Heaven Burns Red as a full-blown RPG due to the sheer amount of reading as the main form of taking in information about the world, story, and its characters. Likewise, I can't call Rants a full-on visual novel because even with all the juice being in the text, the gameplay is a mandatory component of progressing and a part of the world building. Like slapping on a label for any genre, calling something a visual novel brings weight and expectations to the format of the experience. They are unique in that they can take advantage of both visual and text mediums with so much flexibility to tell stories in a way others can't or would struggle to do. And given the digital nature of it, makes it so easy to shift the medium of storytelling on a dime. That's why I think it's important to make that distinction between pure and gameplay VNs. Sometimes you just want a rich novel you can sit and think over your rhythmic clicks. Other times you may want to be a bit more active in your thoughts and decision making while benefiting from what a nice book would give you. So I would draw the line right there in front of Rants and right in the middle of where HBR is standing. Any less novelly than those two, and the novel part is sort of lost.
Hello, I am MR, an unlicensed yapper.
And I'm Taros from the VNture podcast. Radiant Wave promised to pay us an exposure, so here are our answers to what the requirements are to be a visual novel.
Here are my 3 cents. First, and probably the most hot take-ish, it has to be vaguely anime-esque aesthetic. I know, hold your pitchforks. But for me, every time I experience games that claim to be VNs, but are far removed from this aesthetic, I instinctively question whether or not they are what they claim. Secondly, completion. VNs have to be complete. This does not necessarily mean the plot finishes within a single title. It can have multiple entries, but every entry in the series is a complete experience. Yes, this means stuff like live service or gacha games are not VNs. Thirdly, the dominant way in which it tells the story is via text, with some enhancements such as visuals and sound. You know, kinda like a book, but with visuals, or like a digital novel. What could even say a visual novel? How about you, Taurus?
Yes. For me, I have two requirements. One, reading must be the focus. It sounds obvious, but if the gameplay is the focus, then it's not a visual novel. Simple. And secondly, it must have narration. If the only writing is in character voice lines and dialogue, then it's not a novel. Throughout the many years of visual novel fandom, there's been a lot of debate of what makes a visual novel, and a lot of people tend to include some instances that are more focused on the gameplay. Titles like Danganronpa, Ace Attorney, 13 Sentinels, or Heaven Burns Red. And that's always rubbed against my beliefs the wrong way. My benchmark has always been, is Fire Emblem a visual novel? Obviously not, but break it down. A Fire Emblem game might have standout characters, story, and dialogue, but no one would consider it a VN. So whenever I have my beliefs of what aspects define a visual novel, I always use Fire Emblem as the litmus test. And so, I always look for reading being the focus, and that there must be narration in some form. Thank you, everyone. Especially thank you to Radiant Wave for inviting us, and VNture out.
VNture out.
どうもあかりです。メイリンの代理人として今回の話題に関して意見を言わせていただきたいと思います。よろしくお願いします。さて本題に入りますが、要するにビジュアルノベルというゲームジャーナルとビジュアルノベルという表現媒体が混同されていることが原因ではないかと考えています。映像や音声に加え、ゲーム要素がセリフと字の文だけで構成されたテキスト、つまりプレイヤーに求められる主な行為が読むことに限られる形式をビジュアルノベル媒体と呼びます。そういった媒体だけに頼って作られたゲームはビジュアルノベルというゲームジャンルに分類されます。しかし問題をさらにややこしくする要素が残念ながらもう一つあります。それはビジュアルノベルという媒体はほぼ架空のコンセプトだという点です。ゲームに本格的なストーリーがつくようになってから会話シーンも必然的に登場するようになりました。そしてそういうシーンの画面構成を見ると立ち絵とテキストボックスがあって外見上は一般的な馴染み深いビジュアルノベルとほとんど変わりません。では何が異なるのか。ビジュアルノベルという媒体には字の文があるという一点です。言い換えれば読まなければ把握できない情報がシーン内に含まれている場合、その形式はビジュアルノベルとなります。念のため一つを補足しておきましょう。日本語がわからないためにセリフの字幕を読む必要があるというだけではビジュアルノベルにはなりません。字の文が存在しないのであればそれは単なる会話シーンに過ぎません。要するにビジュアルノベル媒体のみで構成されたゲームをビジュアルノベルと呼びます。まあミニゲームくらい入っててもビジュアルノベルのままでいいと思いますけど、一方で作品全体の主軸ではないもののビジュアルノベル媒体の形式を厳密に踏襲したシーンがたまに挿入される場合、その部分だけはビジュアルノベルあるいはビジュアルノベルシーンと呼べます。ゲーム全体としてはあくまでもハイブリッドでビジュアルノベルそのものではありません。以上が自分の見解です。異論は受け付けません。
Hello everyone, this is Ange. So as someone who has been reading visual novels for over 15 years now, I've had my thoughts of what exactly defines a visual novel, and, well, let's just say I might have some hot takes on that. As someone who started the medium with the original Fate Stay Night all the way back in the late 2000s, I've kind of used that as my original baseline, aka something that's literally just all reading with maybe some choices and some bad endings if the VN wants to get that complicated. It's once we start taking gameplay into account when things get really tricky. A lot of people in VNDB's rules that are inconsistently applied, I may add, usually go by like a ratio of gameplay to visual novel reading. I would personally go a step further. How much can the gameplay impede you just reading text? Basically, how much do you have to click, press a button, or be forced to think for things beyond advancing text or choosing choices? This is one of the reasons why I personally disagree with many people calling the Ace Attorney, Danganronpa, and the Zero Escape series of visual novels as the primary popular examples. You just have to click on too many things and think too much to actually advance the story. You can't just read the story at your own pace. These are great mystery games 100%, but not visual novels in my eyes. Not every story-heavy game with a lot of text has to be a visual novel. There are quite a bunch of fringe cases related to gameplay reading ratios for VN, so I'll limit myself on examples. In key visual novels starting from Clannad, there are optional minigames you can do. They're relatively short and just revolve around a little bit of clicking, maybe a little bit of RNG, but for the most part, you do not need them to advance the story, and they may appear in maybe 5% of the total experience. The closest to required gameplay is Little Busters, with how you have to do a dungeon crawler segment to beat Saya's route, but that's in one route that you can only access after reading the true route. Basically, I consider every modern key title a visual novel, except Heaven Burns Red. Fuck required gacha gameplay to read the story. Another great fringe case is Symphonic Rain, one of my favorite Nakige. This one has a music minigame that, thank God, there's literally a way for the VN to auto-win the minigames because you need to get passing grades to advance the story. Thankfully, there's maybe only 10 spots total you have to play these anyway, so even if these weren't skippable, they're like maybe 5% of the experience at best of a fairly long VN. On more negative fringe cases, I actually think something like the Urawareru Mono series and basically any of the gameplay-heavy Alisoft titles do not count as VNs. Urawareru Mono does have long stretches of story, but you're required to have at least decently long, required, uninterruptible strategy RPG segments, and even clicking different choice spots in story-heavy areas just to interact with other characters. That alone halts the story enough to the point where we consider the series not VNs. Similarly, with Alisoft games like Every Rant's Title, Eventical, and Dona Dona, you are required to do decently involved gameplay to advance the story. You can't just simply enjoy Rand's doing his raping conquest thing, or enjoy seeing a sex rebellion in Dona Dona in almost purely text form. I could go on, but you get the idea. To me, when deciding if a story game with gameplay were to count as a visual novel, the segments have to be short or simple, less than 5 to 10% of the experience, and make it so there's at least a way to make it optional if it does have to get in the way. If you are constantly required to interact with things that are not choices, that's not a visual novel in my eyes. Remember, the term visual novels has novels in the name, not games.
Now I guess I need to share my own take on the topic as well. I can't let everyone else take the heat. Just because I'm placing my response towards the back end of this video, don't take that as me trying to downplay everyone else's responses. I feel like everyone else, despite maybe having an opinion that you don't necessarily agree with, I would say every single opinion is perfectly valid, and this is the whole reason I came up with this video, was so that way you can get that broad spectrum of everyone's personal opinions and see that yes, everyone is going to have a different take as to what they would define as a visual novel. And so for me, I want to say I have more of that loose interpretation of what would be defined as a visual novel. I kind of split it up into different categories, where I would say there is maybe a quote-unquote dedicated visual novel, and then maybe you have gameplay VNs, you have gacha VNs, and then maybe console VNs. So yeah, I would say that I have a pretty wider range of what I consider a visual novel, but I guess getting into what we're probably really trying to hit on the topic of this video is something like Heaven Burns Red, a visual novel. Where exactly do I draw the hard line? I was kind of thinking about it, and I guess you could say maybe I'm cheating a little bit off of everyone else's responses, considering I've heard a fair amount of them by the time that I'm recording my response. I was kind of surprised that despite me not actually mentioning it when I sent out these invitations to everyone, that a decent amount of people brought up Fire Emblem as an example of a game that maybe sits right on that line for what is a visual novel, and that Fire Emblem I would not consider a visual novel, but if I heard somebody say, hey, like Fire Emblem Three Houses is a visual novel, I could kind of see that. It's got like the romance aspects, it's got branching paths, it's got like that kind of, character portrait with the anime art style, and then like it's very story driven. But at the same time, I wanted to kind of consider like, okay, well, if I could use Fire Emblem as an example, maybe we can compare it to a game that I have fresh in my memory, being Acelia the Eternal, which has a similar like gameplay style as well. And why is it that we can consider Acelia the Eternal a visual novel, but Fire Emblem isn't? And I think just using these two as like a comparison, I could literally sit here and maybe play out like the introductory or like an early portion of both games and seeing how much is like the downtime of reading into when you actually get to the gameplay aspect. But at the same time, I'm not going to do that. I do think that Acelia the Eternal probably would win out as far as like how much time you're sitting down reading as opposed to doing gameplay. But I think maybe as far as like something that is kind of like hard to gauge is that I would say maybe I would consider my breaking point for what is and what doesn't qualify as a visual novel is, can it have gameplay? Yes, but I think there has to be a certain like flow to the gameplay. So within Acelia the Eternal, I am just reading text for long portions of time, and whenever I do get shifted into the gameplay, only then can I like access the menus to see like my party members, swap out my equipment, etc., and then go into the gameplay. Fire Emblem, I can actually like on like any point within like the overworld, I can swap around my equipment and change out my team stuff. And I think when using an example like Fire Emblem Three Houses, there is this whole segment where between each like week you are in the monastery and you're allowed to walk around, interact with the different characters, and that's where you kind of get that like relationship side that maybe is somewhat inspired by visual novels. But I would say, yeah, already by saying the word overworld, I think that already kind of like takes away what I would say is maybe the status of being able to qualify it as a visual novel, because over time, throughout playing any like one of the 4 routes within Three Houses, you're gonna have this like, I guess, padding where you are having to walk and there's no dialogue, right? It could be like consolidated by having like a fast travel menu that I can just go ahead and click and go boom and then warp directly to the character. You kind of can like fast travel, but it's not like exact, right? So it is this sort of like filler time that just adds to your overall gameplay, that's taking you out of those experiences of being able to read for long stretches of time. So I think in that specific example, and the example I will use for my response, is that Fire Emblem would not be considered a visual novel because it takes too much time out from being able to experience just reading. So in a way, it becomes more and more of like, okay, how much can I stretch the boundaries of like this video game and say, okay, it still is a novel, it still is like a book. And I can't say that in the case of Fire Emblem. So I would say maybe that is where I would draw the hard line, where I would say maybe looking at something like Heaven Burns Red, it has these long portions, but at the same time, considering like within my broader spectrum of what I would consider, yeah, I would say Heaven Burns Red is a gacha visual novel, like undoubtedly, but at the same time, if we're looking at a quote-unquote dedicated visual novel, I would say it maybe is too much of a game because of the fact that like within its own overworld or like world map within the base, you have fast travel points, but only at like certain portions, and a lot of it is kind of like having to walk from place to place, and is maybe used as a way to kind of give you this like cinematic and also just like immersiveness within the game's world. But at the same time, I want to say that yeah, maybe it doesn't really lean itself as well into Something like another example of like a pretty heavy gameplay visual novel is Baldur's Sky. Same thing, right? Where Baldur's Sky, you have these long portions of reading, and the only times you're able to actually like access your menu and swap out your gear and your loadouts is when the game specifically transitions into those gameplay portions. So yeah, I would say Heaven Burns Red maybe is less on that side. But yeah, that's going to be my response.
I'm not a person with a firm hardline stance of what is or is not a visual novel. I get a lot of questions about Danganronpa and Ace Attorney and if they are ones, and I would say it's close enough to the form, although some might disagree. If anything, I would use those two examples as beginner visual novels for new people to ease themselves into the medium. That said, how I usually judge games if they are visual novels is the main focus and how close it is to the VN reading experience, as vague as that sounds. If the general appealing factor of the title is more about the gameplay, then I would classify it more as a game. Stuff like the Persona series would count here. However, if it's focused around the story and overall narrative experience, then I would say it's more visual novel. Even more so if there's classic VN elements / mechanics, stuff like the text interface and settings. Again, I'm not really concerned all about it too much. For me, it's just an intuition on the spot judgment call, and I'm more flexible than most people, I would like to think.
Where does one draw the line between something that is and isn't a visual novel? It's an interesting question, but one I don't tend to ponder over too much. For the most part, I don't think the distinction matters all that much to begin with. Like, hey, if you consider Ace Attorney and Danganronpa visual novels, that's cool. They have visual novel-like, or really ADV-like presentation, but also gameplay. If you don't consider them visual novels, then that's fair enough as well. The classification of something as a visual novel or not a visual novel doesn't really have any bearing on the quality of the story or the quality of the experience. I think it's entirely arbitrary, which is why rating databases like VNDB end up struggling with what is and isn't classified as a visual novel. I don't think there's a clear-cut rule for the way that I'd personally classify something as a visual novel or not, but in vague terms, when I think of how I make the distinctions, it's dependent on the balance between gameplay and visual novel-like presentation. There's lots of games out there that have both visual novel-like presentation, but also gameplay. Think of the Utaware Rumono trilogy, for instance. It's gameplay heavy, but the majority of the story and the majority of your experience with the games is in visual novel style, so I would consider them to be visual novels outright, SRPGs of course, but still also visual novels. However, I would not consider things like the Persona games or even gacha games like Fate Grand Order to be visual novels because in spite of having tons of ADV style elements, they're too gameplay heavy. They cross that threshold. It's an arbitrary threshold in my mind, but there's definitely a point at which I wouldn't call something a visual novel anymore.
I just once again want to say thank you to all of the amazing people who took time out of their busy schedules to send something in for this video, considering we've already been far past that point of when VNDB had this little bit of a controversy. It takes quite a while to get all these sorts of things put together, so hopefully this topic still feels quite relevant. This has been a number of responses from myself as well as a number of other visual novel content creators here on YouTube as to what we would consider a visual novel. I will have everyone's channels linked in the description below, so go ahead, please go check out all their channels, give them some love as well. But yeah, thank you guys again for watching. I've been Wade, and I'll see you next time.